The Soviet Union was like a giant house of cards. It was held together by fear and force. In 1991, the giant finally crumbled. One by one, the republics declared independence. Chechnya, a small mountainous region in the North Caucasus, was no different. For centuries, the Chechen people yearned for freedom. They had a long history of resistance against Russian rule. They saw their chance and took it. Led by Dzhokhar Dudayev, a former Soviet general, Chechnya declared its independence. The declaration was a bold move. It was a direct challenge to Russia's authority. Russia had just lost its empire. It was a time of chaos and uncertainty. The new Russian Federation, under President Boris Yeltsin, was weak and divided, but it still clung to the idea of a greater Russia. Chechnya's independence was a threat to this vision. Yeltsin refused to recognize Chechnya's independence. He feared that it would set a dangerous precedent. Other republics might follow suit. For the Chechen people, independence was a dream come true. It was a chance to finally govern themselves, to revive their language and culture after decades of Soviet repression. They were determined to defend their newfound freedom. However, their dream was about to be met with the full force of the Russian military. The stage was set for a bloody conflict. Russia's initial response to Chechnya's declaration of independence was hesitant. Yeltsin was preoccupied with internal problems. The Russian economy was in shambles. Political opposition was growing, but hardliners within the Russian government pushed for a military solution. They argued that Chechnya was a hotbed of crime and terrorism. They claimed that Dudayev was a dangerous separatist who needed to be removed. The Russian military was confident that it could crush the Chechen resistance. After all, Russia was a nuclear superpower. Chechnya was a small, impoverished republic with a poorly equipped army. It seemed like an easy victory. In December 1994, Russian tanks rolled into Chechnya. The invasion had begun. The Russians believed it would be a quick and decisive campaign. They were wrong. The Chechens were ready to fight. They were defending their homeland, their families, and their freedom. The Russians had underestimated their resolve. They had also failed to anticipate the brutal urban warfare that awaited them in Grozny, the Chechen capital. The battle for Grozny was a turning point in the First Chechen War. It was a brutal and bloody affair that shocked the world. The Russians had expected to take the city quickly. They thought the Chechens would surrender easily. Instead, they faced fierce resistance from determined fighters. The Chechens were outnumbered and outgunned. They knew they couldn't defeat the Russian army in a conventional battle. So, they resorted to guerrilla tactics. They turned Grozny into a death trap for the invading Russian forces. Chechen fighters, many of whom were veterans of the Soviet-Afghan War, set up ambushes. They used anti-tank weapons to great effect. They knew the city's streets and buildings like the back of their hands. They were fighting for every inch of their city. The Russians were unprepared for this kind of urban warfare. Their tanks and heavy artillery were useless in the narrow streets. They suffered heavy casualties. Thousands of Russian soldiers were killed. The Chechens also suffered heavy losses, but they managed to hold the city for weeks. After the Battle of Grozny, the war in Chechnya changed. The Russians had captured the capital, but they were far from victorious. The Chechen fighters, though battered, were not defeated. They retreated to the mountains in the south. They knew the terrain intimately. It was their best defense against the Russian military machine. The Chechen resistance, led by commanders like Shamil Basayev and Aslan Maskadov, shifted tactics. They waged a relentless guerrilla war against the Russian forces. They launched surprise attacks on Russian convoys and checkpoints. They planted mines and IEDs. They used their knowledge of the mountains to their advantage. The Russians were ill-equipped to fight this kind of war. Their heavy equipment was useless in the mountains. Their soldiers were poorly trained for guerrilla warfare. They became easy targets for the Chechen fighters. The war dragged on. The Russians were bogged down in a bloody and unwinnable conflict. Public opinion in Russia, initially supportive of the war, began to shift. Section 5. The war comes home. Casualties and shifting public opinion. The war in Chechnya was a public relations disaster for the Russian government. The Russian media, though heavily censored, could not hide the truth about the war. The images of dead Russian soldiers coming home in body bags shocked the Russian public. The Russian people had been told that the war would be quick and victorious. They were told that the Chechens were terrorists and bandits who needed to be dealt with. But the reality was far different. The war was long and bloody. The Russian army was not winning. The Russian people began to question why their sons were dying in a distant land. They began to sympathize with the plight of Chechen civilians, who were also suffering terribly in the war. Anti-war protests erupted across Russia. Mothers of soldiers killed in action led the demonstrations. They demanded an end to the bloodshed. Section 6. International pressure, a world watching in horror. The world watched in horror as the conflict in Chechnya escalated. Human rights groups condemned the brutality of the war. Amnesty International accused both sides of war crimes. The indiscriminate shelling of civilian areas, particularly in Grozny, drew international condemnation. The war became a major embarrassment for the Yeltsin government. Western governments pressured Russia to find a peaceful solution. The war in Chechnya was not just a Russian tragedy, it was a stain on the conscience of the world. Section 7. The Negotiator, Maskadov, and the Path to Peace. As the war dragged on, both sides grew weary of the bloodshed. The Chechen side, though determined, was suffering heavy losses. Aslan Maskadov, a pragmatist within the Chechen leadership, emerged as a key figure in the push for peace. He understood that while the Chechens had fought the Russians to a standstill, a military victory was unlikely. Maskadov also recognized the growing discontent within Russia itself. The Russian public had turned against the war. Yeltsin, facing re-election in 1996, was feeling the pressure. Secret talks between Russian and Chechen representatives began. Finding a solution that would satisfy both sides was a daunting task. The Chechens demanded independence. The Russians refused to grant it. Section 8. The Khasavyurt Accord, a bitter pill for Russia. After months of negotiations, a ceasefire agreement was reached in August 1996. The agreement, known as the Khasavyurt Accord, was signed by Alexander Lebed, Russia's Security Council chief, and Aslan Maskadov. The accord was a bitter pill for Russia to swallow. It marked the end of the First Chechen War. It allowed for the withdrawal of Russian troops from Chechnya. It postponed the decision on Chechnya's political status for 5 years. The accord was a victory for the Chechens. They had fought one of the world's most powerful armies to a standstill. They had secured their de facto independence. However, the accord did not bring real peace. The war had left deep scars on both sides. It had sown the seeds of future conflict. Section 9. Conclusion. The seeds of future conflict. The First Chechen War was a tragedy for all involved. Tens of thousands of people were killed. Grozny, once a vibrant city, lay in ruins. The war had a profound impact on both Russia and Chechnya. It radicalized Chechen society, leading to the rise of Islamic extremism. It exposed the weaknesses of the Russian military and the fragility of the Russian state. The Khasavyurt Accord, while bringing an end to the fighting, did not resolve the underlying issues. The status of Chechnya remained unresolved. The First Chechen War was a prelude to a new era of conflict and instability in the North Caucasus. It was a war that Russia lost, but, more importantly, a war that no one won.